Chapter 1. The Velvet Room. The night was heavy with the scent of rain and smoke as Amelia stood before the unmarked black door at the end of the alley. The only sign it existed was the faint crimson glow seeping from its edges, beckoning her closer with a warmth that tingled against her skin. A man in a tailored suit, face hidden in the shadows, nodded once when she approached, then disappeared into the darkness. She swallowed hard, her heart thrumming louder than the storm, and pushed the door open. A rush of warm, perfumed air enveloped her, thick with musk, roses, and something faintly metallic. Beyond lay a room bathed in deep red velvet and flickering candlelight, alive with murmurs, sighs, and a low, haunting melody that sent a shiver down her spine. Her heels sank slightly into the plush carpet as she stepped inside, feeling the oppressive heat wrap around her body like a lover's embrace. Figures moved languidly through the haze, their silhouettes draped in satin and lace, masks concealing their eyes but revealing parted lips glistening with desire. Every breath she drew carried a taste of copper and wine, and her pulse quickened as unseen hands brushed her arm, guiding her deeper. The walls seemed to pulse with the beat of the music, and the shadows between the candles stretched unnaturally long, almost alive. She tried to speak, to ask what this place was, but her voice caught in her throat, swallowed by the sound of faint laughter from above. A man emerged from the crowd, tall and impossibly pale, his black eyes glinting with something between hunger and amusement. He wore no mask, and his smile was sharp enough to cut through the thick air. "You've come," he murmured, his voice low and silken, yet echoing in her skull like a scream. His hand extended, long fingers curling toward hers, and when she took it, a chill shot through her body, raising gooseflesh on her arms despite the heat. He led her to a chaise in the corner where the shadows gathered the thickest and sat her down. The velvet beneath her felt damp, though whether from sweat, wine, or something darker she couldn't say. Around her, the other figures continued their strange, sensual dance, their moans rising in unison with the music. "You wanted to know the truth," he said, crouching in front of her, his breath cold against her neck. His words dripped with something more than suggestion. There was menace beneath the seduction. Before she could respond, he pressed two fingers beneath her chin and tilted her gaze upward. The ceiling was gone, replaced by an endless void of blackness speckled with faint, writhing lights like stars. She felt her mind slide sideways, her stomach lurch as though gravity itself had been undone. A wet sound came from behind her, and she dared not look, though she felt the air grow heavier, the smell of iron growing stronger. A pair of hands, smaller, delicate yet unyielding, covered her eyes as a whisper licked at her ear. "You belong here now," the voice, distinctly feminine, purred. The hands withdrew, and when she opened her eyes, the room had changed. The velvet walls seemed to breathe, bulging with something that pressed from inside, the fabric darkened with what looked like veins. The masked figures were closer now, circling her, their breath hot and sticky against her skin. From somewhere above came a sound halfway between a groan and a sob, and she felt a drop of something warm land on her shoulder. Slowly, she turned her head to see what it was, but the pale man's hand caught her chin again. "Not yet," he hissed, his sharp teeth catching the candlelight as he leaned closer. His other hand traced the line of her throat, nails grazing her skin, leaving behind faint, stinging lines. Her breath hitched, torn between fear and a strange, rising desire that made her limbs weak. The music swelled around them, discordant and frantic now, and the masked dancers moved faster, their motions feverish, frantic, some falling to the floor in tangled ecstasy. He tilted her head further back, exposing her neck, and she felt his tongue, impossibly cold and rough, trace a line from her collarbone to her ear. Every nerve in her body screamed, but she couldn't move. A candle beside her sputtered violently, and the flame flared blue, revealing for just a moment what lurked behind the velvet, glistening shapes writhing in the walls, faces pressed against the fabric, eyes wide and mouths gaping soundlessly. She gasped, but the pale man's hand covered her mouth before she could scream. "If you scream," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear, "they'll hear you. And they'll want to come out." The hands withdrew only when she stilled herself, though her chest heaved as she tried to calm her breathing. The masked figures clapped slowly in approval, though their hands seemed too long, too many fingers curling in the dim light. The room grew darker still, the candles burning lower as the velvet walls began to bleed, thick dark rivulets staining the floor beneath her feet. The pale man smiled wider, revealing rows of teeth too sharp, too numerous, and pressed his thumb to her lips. "It's time," he said, though she didn't understand what he meant. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it hurt her ears. All eyes, human and otherwise, were upon her now, and the dancers froze mid-motion as though caught in amber. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the faint pulse of something alive beneath the floorboards. He leaned in closer, his lips almost grazing hers, and she felt his breath, cold and acrid, fill her lungs. Around them, the walls pulsed harder, the figures closing in until their masks brushed her skin. The pale man's eyes bore into hers, and for a moment she glimpsed something infinite and screaming within them. "Welcome to the Velvet Room," he whispered, his tongue flicking her lips before she could pull away. The candles all extinguished at once, plunging her into blackness thick enough to taste. Something wet and warm coiled around her ankle, pulling her down. She opened her mouth to scream, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Somewhere far above, the haunting melody resumed, softer this time as though coming from behind a closed door. But the words that followed, whispered in 100 voices, made her blood run cold. "One of us." Chapter 2, The Descent. Amelia's scream was strangled as the darkness thickened around her, her body dragged downward by the unseen, wet coil clutching her ankle. The floor beneath her seemed to melt away, leaving her suspended in an abyss where no light dared reach. Her fingers clawed at the air, searching for something solid, but only icy void met her touch. Whispers rose in a deafening chorus from all directions, speaking her name in 1,000 voices, each dripping with desire and malice. She felt her skin prickle, as though invisible eyes caressed her every curve, watching, tasting, claiming her. A sudden cold splash struck her back, and she realized she had landed on something soft, damp, and faintly warm that pulsed beneath her like a living heart. The faintest red glow returned, revealing that she lay upon a vast expanse of velvet stretched tight over shifting shapes. The floor breathed beneath her, heaving slowly, and the warmth seeped into her bones, coaxing shivers of fear and reluctant pleasure. Around her, masked figures watched from the shadows, their shapes larger, stranger now, their movements deliberate and hungry. The pale man appeared again, stepping lightly onto the living floor, his presence commanding silence from the whispers. "You chose this," he said, though she did not remember choosing anything at all. His voice was more guttural now, reverberating through her ribs, and his fingers brushed her cheek, leaving streaks of red where he touched. With a snap of his fingers, the candles reappeared, burning with black flames that bathed the space in a morbid glow. The walls here were alive, veins bulging and bursting, mouths opening silently to release sighs of heat and moisture. Amelia tried to rise but found her arms bound by unseen restraints, silky yet unbreakable, stretching her out on the pulsing floor. The masked figures moved closer, their hands trailing her body, nails scratching, lips grazing, each touch sending sparks of shameful heat and chills of terror up her spine. She gasped, unable to tell where fear ended and desire began, her heartbeat a drumbeat echoing in the dark. The pale man crouched by her ear, his tongue flicking the shell of it as he whispered, "Every inch of you is theirs now." His teeth grazed her throat, sharp enough to draw a single bead of blood that trickled down her collarbone. At once, the figures descended, their masks brushing against her, their hands multiplying, impossibly many, exploring her with a kind of sacred hunger. Amelia thrashed against the restraints, but they tightened in response, the silky bonds cutting into her skin just enough to make her whimper. One masked figure leaned close enough that she could see its eyes, black pits that reflected a universe of writhing, screaming shapes. The ceiling above them rippled, revealing a colossal figure trapped in the velvet, its arms outstretched, its mouth open in a silent wail. Its skin glistened wetly, veined with black and gold, and its enormous eye focused squarely on her. The pale man followed her gaze, smiling cruelly. "He watches all," he murmured. "He decides who stays and who is consumed." Amelia's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling rapidly, the air around her thickening with the scent of roses, iron, and sweat. The masked figures began to chant in a guttural alien language, their voices rising and falling like the tide, each syllable resonating in her bones. Suddenly, the bonds snapped and she was free, but the floor beneath her opened up like a mouth and she fell again. This time the descent was faster, and the air became hotter, thicker, filled with smoke and ash. She landed in another room, smaller, its walls of black velvet studded with candles that wept crimson wax. A massive bed dominated the center, draped in silks that writhed as though alive, and chains hung from the ceiling like silver veins. The pale man appeared once more, this time shirtless, his chest covered in faint scars that glimmered like embers. "Now," he said softly, "you will show your devotion." The bed beckoned her, and despite herself she crawled onto it, her body responding to an ancient command she could not resist. The silks wrapped around her wrists and ankles, lifting her slightly as though offering her to the room itself. The pale man climbed on top of her, his weight both comforting and terrifying, and the candles flared violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. His lips hovered over hers but did not touch. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers and whispered words in that alien tongue. She felt something enter her chest then, cold and searing at once, winding into her ribs, coiling around her heart. The masked figures emerged again, surrounding the bed, their hands raised in silent praise as the room's pulse quickened, every beat shaking her body. Amelia gasped as the pale man finally kissed her, his lips freezing and burning at once, and the shadows behind her eyelids came alive. She saw visions, herself bound to the walls, her skin etched with runes, her eyes black as void. She saw herself dancing among the masked ones, her own mask fused to her face. She saw herself sinking into the velvet floor, screaming in rapture and terror. When the kiss broke, she was trembling, her body slick with sweat and something darker. The pale man licked the blood from her lips and smiled, his sharp teeth glinting as he spoke. "You're halfway there," he said. "One more step and you'll never leave." The masked figures lowered their arms, and the chanting resumed, louder, faster, filling the air with vibrations that rattled her teeth. The bed beneath her began to sink, pulling her down once again, this time into a tunnel of flesh and velvet, the walls contracting and pulsing as though alive. The pale man's laughter followed her into the depths, mingling with the whispers and moans that filled the narrowing darkness. At the very end of the tunnel, a faint light appeared, red and wet, like a wound in the world, and a familiar voice called her name from within. The air was suffocating, but her body moved of its own accord, crawling toward the light, desperate and terrified. As she reached the threshold, her fingers brushed the slick floor, and the voice, low and echoing, spoke again, its words wrapping around her like chains. "Come to me," it said, and the final breath of cold air passed over her skin as she crossed into the unknown. Behind her, the tunnel closed, sealing her away from whatever lay above. The light grew brighter, blinding now, and the scent of roses and blood overwhelmed her senses. She stumbled forward, feeling the ground shift under her feet, and the laughter that followed her turned into a deafening roar. Something immense and unseen moved in the red-lit chamber ahead, and Amelia could not tell if her body shivered from fear or anticipation as the shadows swallowed her once more. Chapter 3, The Crimson Chamber. Amelia shielded her eyes as the blinding red light flared brighter, its warmth like a searing brand against her skin. When she finally lowered her hand, she stood at the threshold of a massive chamber, its walls pulsing like muscle, veined with black and gold. The floor was slick and alive, writhing beneath her bare feet, while a smell of roses and iron thickened the air to the point of suffocation. The voice that had called her name whispered again, closer this time, its tone equal parts caress and command. "Step forward," it urged, and her body obeyed, though her mind screamed to turn back. Figures loomed in the corners, larger than any she had seen before, their forms only partially visible in the bloody light. They moved with serpentine grace, their countless eyes tracking her as she approached the center of the room. There, a throne of bone and velvet rose from the floor, and seated upon it was a figure that dwarfed even the pale man, its skin white as marble, its face veiled, and its long fingers tipped with claws that drummed lazily against the armrest. The voice came from it, though its mouth never moved. "You are mine now," it declared, and the walls quaked at its words. The pale man stood at the foot of the throne, his head bowed, his form shrouded in shadows that writhed like snakes. When he looked up at her, his black eyes gleamed with pride and something darker, something ravenous. "Kneel," he commanded softly, and though her knees buckled against her will, she forced herself upright, defiance flickering in her gaze. The veiled figure laughed then, a sound like steel scraping stone, and extended a hand toward her. A chain of light and shadow appeared, snaking through the air, wrapping around her wrists and ankles, binding her in place. Amelia gasped as the chains bit into her flesh, the pain sharp but mingled with an inexplicable heat that coursed through her veins. The throne room erupted in applause from the shadows, the faceless figures clapping, their elongated fingers snapping in rhythm to a hidden melody. The veiled figure stood, towering over her now, and its clawed hand cupped her chin, tilting her face upward. "You have tasted fear and desire," it murmured, its voice echoing in her skull. "But you have yet to choose. Will you serve willingly or be consumed?" Her breath came in shallow bursts as the masked figures closed in, circling her, their chants rising in a cacophony of alien syllables. The pale man stepped closer, his fingers brushing her cheek, his smile sharp and full of promise. Say the words, he hissed in her ear. Submit and you will know pleasure beyond imagining. Resist and, well. His smile widened further, and the shadows behind him shifted, revealing glistening shapes with mouths that opened too wide and teeth that glinted hungrily. Amelia's throat tightened but no sound escaped. Suddenly the chains slackened and she fell to her knees, her palms sinking into the fleshy floor. The veiled figure gestured, and a dagger of black crystal materialized before her, its blade pulsing with crimson veins. Blood or soul, it intoned, your offering seals your fate. The room held its breath, the whispers silenced, the masked figures frozen in their positions, all eyes on her trembling hands. She reached for the dagger, feeling its cold weight in her fingers, its point dragging a line of fire across her palm. The choice was hers, or so they let her believe. As she raised the blade, the pale man's voice cut through the silence, dark and coaxing. Do it, he urged. Claim your place among us. The veiled figure loomed closer, its claw resting lightly on her shoulder now, a silent promise of what awaited beyond this moment. Amelia's chest heaved, her mind awash with images of herself in endless torment and ecstasy, bound and free all at once. The dagger trembled in her grip as the walls began to pulse faster, the room alive with anticipation. With a sharp breath, she drew the blade across her palm, crimson spilling onto the floor, the scent of copper mingling with the roses and musk that permeated the chamber. A roar rose up from the shadows, the masked figures throwing their heads back in unison, their voices joining in a triumphant cry. The chains tightened once more, but this time they felt like an embrace, sinking into her skin, becoming a part of her. The veiled figure nodded in approval, its claws tracing the curve of her neck. The dagger dissolved into smoke, and the pale man's hands were suddenly at her waist, lifting her to her feet. It is done, he whispered, his breath cold against her ear. The throne behind the veiled figure cracked open, revealing a staircase spiraling down into darkness, its steps slick and alive. You belong to the Crimson Chamber now, the veiled figure declared, its voice louder than the screams and cries that filled the air. The masked figures bowed low, parting to create a path toward the stairs. Amelia hesitated at the top of the stairs, her pulse thundering in her ears, the warmth of her blood still dripping from her hand. The pale man stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her back, the other holding the remnants of her chain like a leash. Go, he murmured, his voice a command and a caress. Your next trial awaits. And with a final breathless glance into the veiled figure's fathomless gaze, she stepped down, the shadows swallowing her whole as the laughter and applause of the chamber followed her into the depths below. Chapter 4, The Endless Stair. The stairs seemed to stretch forever, spiraling downward into the choking dark. Each step pulsed under Amelia's feet, slick and warm, whispering her name with every motion. The air grew heavier as she descended, thick with the scent of blood and something older, something ancient and sweet. Behind her, the faint laughter of the chamber above faded into silence, leaving only the sound of her own breath and the faint wet thrum of the stairs beneath her. The pale man's chain still coiled around her wrist, though when she looked back, he was nowhere to be seen, yet his presence pressed against her skin as if he lingered just out of sight. The deeper she went, the stranger the walls became, veins growing thicker, glistening with black ichor that dripped in slow, steady rhythms. Shapes moved behind the flesh of the stairwell, their forms indiscernible but their intent undeniable, watching, waiting. At intervals, torches embedded into the walls sputtered with cold blue flames, casting shifting shadows that writhed like living things. The whispers returned too, rising and falling in a language she did not understand, yet which stirred some dark corner of her soul. Each step seemed to demand more from her, the weight of her choice pressing heavier with every breath. She paused at one landing where the stairs split, each path vanishing into a different kind of darkness. To her left, the air carried a sweet, intoxicating musk, promising pleasures she dared not name. To her right, a metallic tang filled the air, sharp and biting like rust and blood. The whispers urged her toward both paths, a cacophony of longing and malice. As she stood, frozen, the chain tugged sharply, pulling her toward the right. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as her body obeyed, the air growing colder, the shadows sharper. The walls began to close in as she descended further, the stair narrowing into a suffocating passage where she had to press her hands against the slick surface to keep her balance. The flesh beneath her fingers quivered at her touch, almost responding. Faces began to form in the walls then, mouths opening silently as if to scream, their empty eyes following her every move. One mouth, larger than the rest, split wide beside her head and whispered her name, the sound wet and eager. Her knees weakened, but the chain pulled again, demanding she continue. At last, the stairway ended at a vast archway veiled in black silk that fluttered though no breeze stirred. Beyond, a dim light glowed, throbbing like a heartbeat, and the smell of blood was overpowering now. She reached out, her fingers brushing the silk, which clung to her skin like oil before parting to reveal the chamber beyond. It was circular, the walls studded with countless eyes, some open and watching, others closed as though sleeping. At the center stood an altar, low and carved from black stone, its surface glistening with fresh crimson. The chain uncoiled from her wrist and slithered away into the dark, vanishing between the stones. Amelia stumbled forward, drawn toward the altar, her breath coming faster now, her chest tight with fear and some terrible anticipation. Above her, the ceiling shifted like a sky of flesh and stars, constellations of pale lights flickering in strange patterns. As she reached the altar, she noticed faint carvings etched into the stone, scenes of figures much like herself bound, kneeling, screaming, and exulting beneath towering veiled forms. A figure stepped from the shadows then, taller even than the veiled figure above, draped in robes that shimmered with darkness itself. Its face was a blank oval of smooth, glistening black, and its long arms ended in delicate, clawed fingers. It moved silently to her side, placing one hand over hers and guiding it to the altar. The stone was warm and wet beneath her palm, and her skin prickled at the contact. "The next offering," the figure said, its voice both male and female, a chorus of whispers all around her. "Your fear. Your will. Or your flesh." Her eyes fluttered closed as the figure leaned closer, its breath impossibly cold and scented of roses and ash. The whispers from the walls swelled into a maddening chant, urging her to choose, to surrender, to submit. She opened her eyes to see the figure produce a blade of bone and obsidian, placing it on the altar before her. "Choose," it demanded softly, its claw resting just above her heart. Amelia's hand hovered over the blade, trembling as the room itself seemed to tighten around her, the weight of countless unseen eyes pressing into her very soul. She reached for the blade, and the whispers ceased all at once, the silence more terrifying than the noise had been. As her fingers closed around the hilt, the figure stepped back, its faceless gaze fixed on her. The altar flared briefly beneath her touch, crimson light seeping through the cracks in the stone. She lifted the blade, feeling its strange weight, and turned her gaze upward toward the shifting ceiling. Above her, the pale man appeared once more, his black eyes gleaming, his lips curved in a cruel smile as he whispered from the shadows. "Deeper still, little one." And as she pressed the blade into her palm, the chamber around her came alive, the walls and floor quaking, the countless eyes opening wide to watch her bleed. The figure before her nodded once, and the altar split open, revealing a stairway descending even deeper, lined with teeth that gleamed like polished ivory. "Enter," the figure intoned, and the whispers resumed in a fevered pitch. Amelia hesitated only a heartbeat longer before stepping forward, the blade still in her hand, and descended into the waiting maw of the abyss. Chapter 5. The Maw Below. The stairs of ivory teeth closed behind Amelia as she descended, the grinding sound echoing in her skull like distant thunder. The air here was thick, viscous, clinging to her skin like a second flesh as she moved deeper into the darkness. The faint glow of the blade in her hand pulsed in time with her heartbeat, its crimson veins growing brighter with each step she took. The whispers from above had vanished, replaced by something lower, deeper, a guttural growl that resonated through her bones and made her stomach churn. Still, she pressed forward, compelled by something she could not name. The walls of the tunnel narrowed into a throat-like passage, the fleshy surface quivering beneath her fingers as she steadied herself. Occasionally, the teeth lining the path snapped together behind her, closing off any thought of retreat. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of old earth and something sour, metallic. Shadows moved ahead, barely glimpsed shapes that slithered just out of sight. Her bare feet splashed through shallow puddles of dark liquid that clung to her skin, each step leaving faint, steaming footprints behind her. The blade in her hand throbbed with heat now, as if feeding on her fear. After what felt like hours, the passage opened into a cavern vast beyond comprehension, lit by a faint red glow that radiated from a lake of thick, black fluid at its center. The surface of the lake rippled despite the absence of any wind, and strange shapes floated just beneath, limbs, faces, torsos, only to dissolve when she tried to focus on them. The growl deepened into a voice, incomprehensible yet impossible to ignore, reverberating from the far end of the cavern. Amelia stepped closer to the lake, her reflection in its surface warped and twisting, her eyes black and hollow, her mouth stretched in a silent scream. The pale man appeared again on the opposite shore, his figure indistinct and flickering like a mirage. "You've come farther than most," he called across the lake, his voice both mocking and approving. He lifted a hand and the surface of the black water rose into grotesque shapes, half human, half nightmare, reaching toward her. "But the maw does not open for the weak," he added, his grin wide and cruel. Amelia tightened her grip on the blade, feeling its heat burn her palm, and stepped onto a narrow bridge of bone that rose from the water to meet her feet. The bridge swayed and groaned as she crossed, the lake below churning violently, hands and jaws snapping at her ankles from beneath the surface. Each step forward was an act of defiance, and with every stride she felt herself growing colder, heavier, as though the lake sought to drag her under. The pale man waited at the other end, his black eyes unblinking, his arms open as though welcoming her home. But just as she reached him, the bridge shuddered violently, and the water erupted, a massive shape surging up from the depths. The creature that rose from the lake was beyond comprehension, a mass of teeth, eyes and flesh, its roar shattering the cavern's silence. It wrapped around the bridge, its countless mouths whispering and screaming in a symphony of madness. The pale man merely watched, smiling as the creature's gaze fixed on Amelia, its largest eye dilating as it leaned closer. "The maw has chosen," the pale man whispered, his voice almost tender now. "Feed it or be devoured." The blade in her hand pulsed furiously, demanding an answer. Her breath came fast and shallow as the creature's many mouths opened wider, a wind like a hurricane tearing at her hair and clothes. She raised the blade high, the crimson veins now blazing like fire, and drove it into her palm once more. Blood spilled onto the bridge, dripping into the lake below, and the creature recoiled, screaming, its flesh quivering as if in ecstasy. The pale man's smile widened, his teeth glinting in the red light. "Good," he murmured, stepping aside as the bridge carried her to the shore. The creature began to sink back into the depths, its massive eye closing slowly, its whispers fading into the black water. Amelia collapsed to her knees on the shore, the blade still clutched in her bloodied hand, her body trembling with exhaustion and something darker, a strange exhilaration. The pale man crouched beside her, his hand brushing her cheek with something almost resembling affection. "You've been claimed," he said softly, his black eyes boring into hers. "But the maw is only the beginning." Behind him, the cavern wall split open, revealing another path, a tunnel lined with flesh and stone, glowing faintly like a dying ember. The pale man stood and offered his hand to her, his grin both inviting and menacing. "Come now," he said. "There's so much more to see." Amelia stared at the gaping passage, her breath catching in her throat, as the whispers began again, louder this time, calling her deeper into the abyss. With a final, shuddering breath, she placed her hand in his, and together they stepped into the dark. The maw closed behind them, the sound of grinding teeth echoing through the cavern as the lake grew still once more. Only the faintest ripple disturbed its black surface, a single crimson drop sinking into its depths, and then all was quiet but for the whispers ahead, beckoning her ever forward. Chapter 6, The Hall of Veins. The whispers grew louder as Amelia and the pale man entered the new tunnel, the sound like countless mouths pressed to her ears, speaking her name in tones of reverence and hunger. The air was warmer here, thick with the metallic tang of blood and a faint sweetness that made her dizzy. The walls pulsed with light, veins glowing beneath the fleshy surface, branching outward like rivers of molten gold. The pale man held her hand lightly, his skin cold as ice yet comforting, his black eyes fixed ahead. "We are close," he murmured, though she dared not ask to what. As they moved forward, the tunnel widened into a grand corridor lined with tall, arching columns of twisted bone and sinew. Between them, faint shadows flickered, human shapes, or what was left of them, writhing silently, their faces hidden by dark veils. The whispers rose in pitch as she passed each figure, and some turned toward her, their hands lifting as though to touch, but the pale man's gaze kept them at bay. The floor beneath her feet was slick and warm, faintly trembling with each step as though alive. The corridor led to a set of immense double doors, carved from a dark stone that gleamed like obsidian, etched with runes she could not decipher. From behind the doors came a low, steady sound, like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. The pale man released her hand and ran his fingers across the carvings, and the doors shuddered before parting, releasing a rush of warm, fragrant air that smelled of roses, ash and something sharp. He gestured for her to enter, his smile calm but his eyes alight with dark anticipation. Amelia stepped through, her breath catching in her throat as she entered a vast chamber. The walls were alive here, covered in layers of flesh and eyes that blinked in slow unison. The ceiling arched high above, dripping with what looked like molten gold, which splattered onto the floor with soft hisses. At the center stood a massive dais, upon which rested a great throne of bone and velvet, taller and more imposing than the one she had seen before. Seated upon it was a figure draped in robes of crimson and black, its face hidden by a veil of chain and shadow. As she approached, the whispers fell silent and the figure spoke, its voice soft yet resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "You have journeyed far, child of fear and fire. You have been tasted, tested, and claimed." Its clawed hand rose and a single finger pointed at her chest. "Now you shall be bound." The pale man appeared at her side, his fingers grazing her arm, his breath icy on her skin. He produced a chain wrought of shadow and silver, its links writhing in his hands, and draped it over her shoulders. The chain tightened around her throat and wrists, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her she no longer belonged to herself. The figure on the throne stood then, its veil swaying like water, and descended the dais. Its presence was suffocating, a gravity that made her knees weaken, her head bow. When it reached her, its hand cupped her cheek, its claw trailing down her neck, leaving faint lines that burned and froze at once. "You have earned your place," it whispered, its breath sweet and acrid. "But you have not yet given all." It stepped back and the floor before the dais opened, revealing a deep pit filled with writhing shadows and faint, pleading cries. The pale man's smile widened, his teeth flashing as he tugged at her chain. "To ascend you must descend," he said softly, his voice tinged with cruel delight. Amelia's fingers tightened around the blade still in her hand, its veins now dim as though waiting for her to choose again. The pit below exhaled a warm wind that smelled of blood and roses, beckoning her closer. The veiled figure gestured, and the eyes on the walls blinked in unison, their gaze heavy upon her. The whispers returned, but now they spoke clearly, one word over and over, filling her mind: "Jump." The pale man leaned close, his lips grazing her ear, and whispered, "Prove yourself." She glanced back once, meeting his black eyes before stepping to the edge of the pit. The shadows writhed eagerly below, and her breath caught as she felt the chain loosen around her throat, then tighten around her heart. With a final, trembling breath, she spread her arms and let herself fall, the whispers surging into a deafening roar as the pit swallowed her whole. The air rushed past her, the walls slick and alive as they closed around her descent. The blade fell with her, its glow returning, bright and hungry. She shut her eyes as the darkness grew red and warm, the scent of roses overwhelming her senses. The last thing she heard before the world vanished was the pale man's voice, faint and amused, deeper still. And then there was nothing but the dark and the promise of what lay below. Chapter 7, The Womb of Silence. Amelia plunged through the dark, her body weightless as the roar of the pit faded into an eerie silence. The warmth of the air thickened into something almost liquid, clinging to her like a second skin. The faint glow of her blade brightened enough for her to glimpse the walls of the shaft, slick, pulsating tissue that shuddered with her passage, veins glowing faintly with gold. Then she struck bottom, her feet sinking into a soft, wet surface that gave way beneath her before solidifying again. When she stood, she was in a vast, enclosed space, sealed tight with no visible exits. The chamber pulsed with a dim, rose-tinted light, its walls slick and warm, alive with faint whispers that crawled just at the edge of hearing. Amelia staggered forward, the chain around her throat and heart growing taut, as though guiding her deeper into the womb-like space. The air was dense, almost unbreathable, and the sweet-sour scent of blood and roses mingled until it made her dizzy. A faint hum vibrated through her bones, rhythmic, maternal, and terrible, the heartbeat of something colossal and unseen. Shapes began to emerge in the walls, forms of women and men, naked and still, their eyes closed, their skin faintly glowing beneath the flesh that encased them. Some appeared peaceful, others twisted in silent agony, and as she passed, their lips moved faintly, whispering in unison, "Welcome." The chain around her wrists heated, the silver links burning patterns into her skin as she moved toward the center of the chamber. The blade in her hand pulsed with each heartbeat in the walls, hungering. The center of the chamber was dominated by a massive cocoon of veined, translucent flesh suspended above the floor, slowly turning in the humid air. Within it, a silhouette curled, humanoid but larger than life, its head crowned with horns, its hands folded across its chest. The whispers grew louder here, rising into a soft chant, words she could almost understand, an invitation and a warning in equal measure. The cocoon split slightly, leaking a thin stream of warm golden fluid that pooled at her feet. The pale man appeared again, stepping from the shadows without a sound. He looked more ethereal now, his form half shrouded in mist, but his black eyes still burned. "You've reached the heart," he said softly, his voice tinged with something like awe. "Now you must awaken it." He extended a long finger, pointing to the cocoon, his grin sharp and knowing. "But know this, what you wake will never sleep again." His hand grazed her cheek briefly before he vanished, his laughter curling in the still air. Amelia stood motionless for a moment, her eyes fixed on the figure within the cocoon. The whispers swelled to a fever pitch, demanding, begging, coaxing. The chain at her throat tightened, cutting off her breath until she staggered forward, her knees sinking into the pool of golden fluid. The warmth seeped into her skin, her blood pounding in her ears, her body alive with both fear and hunger. The blade in her hand flared, its veins glowing as if in anticipation. She raised the blade high, her reflection in the cocoon's surface unrecognizable. Her eyes black voids, her lips parted in a silent snarl, the chains glinting against her skin. The whispers fell into silence, leaving only her breath and the heartbeat beneath her feet. She pressed the blade into the cocoon's surface, and it slid in as though piercing soft fruit. The figure inside stirred, its fingers twitching, its head lifting slightly. The cocoon split open with a wet tearing sound, golden light spilling out and washing over the chamber. The air shook with a low, guttural cry that made her bones vibrate and her blood freeze. The humanoid form unfolded itself slowly, impossibly tall, its horned head brushing the ceiling, its skin glistening with golden ichor. Its eyes opened, black pools with flecks of fire, and fixed on her. The chains around her glowed hot, binding her in place as the creature stepped down to the floor. It crouched before her, its massive clawed hand cupping her cheek almost tenderly, its breath hot and sweet on her face. "You have awakened me," it rumbled, its voice echoing from every corner of the chamber, inside her mind, inside her bones. "And now you are mine." The walls around them began to throb faster, the golden light intensifying until it blinded her, the heat suffocating, the whispers returning in a triumphant chorus. Amelia fell to her knees, the blade slipping from her grasp, the chains melting into her skin, and the creature's massive shadow engulfed her completely. The last thing she felt before the darkness took her was the creature's lips against her forehead and its words, both promise and threat, deeper still. Chapter 8, The Crimson Crown. Darkness enveloped Amelia, thick and absolute, as if the entire world had ceased to exist. But within the void, heat blossomed, a searing, suffocating warmth that wrapped her body and sank into her bones. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the womb-like chamber but kneeling in the center of a vast hall of mirrors. Each pane reflected not herself but twisted versions. Some screaming, some grinning, some chained to thrones of flesh and bone. Above her, the horned figure loomed, its eyes burning with black fire, the chains linking them both glowing white-hot. The whispers followed her here, louder than ever now, a relentless chorus chanting her name and titles she did not understand: Bride of the Maw, Bearer of the Crimson Crown, Mother of Silence. The creature circled her slowly, its talons scraping the mirrored floor, each step sending shivers up her spine. "You have descended farther than any before you," it murmured, its voice deep and resonant, shaking the hall. "But you are not yet whole." It raised a clawed hand and gestured to the nearest mirror, which rippled as though alive. In the glass she saw herself again, but this version wore a crown of thorns and roses, her skin etched with black sigils that glowed faintly. Her eyes glimmered void black, her lips stained with blood, yet her expression was serene, regal. The creature's claws brushed her shoulder, almost a caress. "You must take her place," it said softly, "or be devoured by what you have awakened." Its massive hand extended toward the mirror, beckoning her to rise. The chains tugged at her wrists, pulling her upright. The mirrored floor beneath her feet began to crack, golden light bleeding through the fractures. Amelia's heart raced as her reflection stepped forward from the glass, its movements perfect and alien at once. The two stood face to face, the chain now connecting them both. The whispers fell silent for a single breath, replaced by the faint sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. Then the reflection spoke, its voice her own but laced with menace. "Take me in," it commanded. "Only then will you wear the crown." Her blade appeared again in her hand, heavy and warm, its veins flaring as though it too yearned for what was about to come. The creature loomed closer, its black eyes narrowing in approval. Amelia raised the blade, feeling the weight of all she'd endured, the rooms, the chains, the whispers, the darkness, and plunged it into her reflection's chest. The mirror shattered on impact, light exploding outward, washing over the chamber in a torrent of heat and sound. She fell backward, gasping as the shards dissolved into her skin, searing and cold at once. The creature's laughter thundered around her as the chains tightened, melting into her flesh, replacing her veins with molten gold. Pain bloomed through her body but quickly gave way to something stranger, a rush of strength, of clarity, of hunger. The crown of thorns and roses now sat upon her head, its weight terrible yet right, as though it had always belonged there. The mirrors around her darkened, now reflecting only the new figure she had become, regal, monstrous, and magnificent. The whispers resumed, now not as tormentors but as worshippers, their voices dripping with adoration and fear. The horned creature bowed low before her, its massive body coiled in submission. "You have taken the crown," it intoned. "You have become what you sought to awaken." It raised its head then, and for the first time she saw its face, a perfect mirror of her own, crowned in gold and shadow. Amelia felt her lips curve into a slow smile, her black eyes scanning the hall of mirrors. The chains that had once bound her now danced like serpents at her sides, alive and obedient. "What now?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of countless whispers, echoing through the chamber. The creature's grin widened as it answered, "Now you reign." The mirrored floor split apart beneath her, revealing yet another staircase descending into red-lit depths. The air was alive with heat and perfume, the walls pulsing in anticipation. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her blade in one hand and the chains swirling around her. The crown burned against her skin, yet she did not falter. The creature followed, its voice a low purr behind her, "Deeper still, my queen." And as she began her descent, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, singing her name and titles as she moved into the waiting dark, the hall sealing itself behind her, leaving only silence and the faint scent of roses. Chapter 9, The Throne Below. The red-lit depths welcomed Amelia like a lover, the heat and scent of roses wrapping around her as she descended the endless stair. The walls glowed faintly, veins of molten gold running through them, and each step sang beneath her feet, a faint chime of chains and whispers. The crown on her head pulsed with warmth, its thorns biting into her scalp just enough to remind her who she was now. The creature followed at a distance, its immense form barely visible in the shimmering haze behind her, its claws clinking softly against the stone. At the bottom of the stairs, the path opened into a cavernous hall so vast it swallowed all sound. Its ceiling disappeared into blackness, and the floor was a mosaic of bones and obsidian, glinting crimson in the low light. At the center stood a throne unlike any before, enormous, forged of black stone and sinew, encrusted with eyes that blinked lazily. Around it, rows of chained figures knelt, their veiled heads bowed, their whispers rising like incense into the air, "Our queen! Our queen!" Amelia walked forward, each step striking sparks from the floor. The chains at her sides slithered forward eagerly, coiling around the throats of the kneeling figures as she passed, tightening until the whispers grew louder and more desperate. The air thickened with heat and longing, and her own breath came shallow, her pulse loud in her ears. The horned creature moved to the edge of the hall, watching silently, its grin sharp and approving. When she reached the foot of the throne, she paused, her eyes meeting those of the creature. Its massive head inclined slightly, its voice a low rumble that shook the stones. "It is yours, queen. Sit and be enthroned." The chains tugged at her wrists and ankles, urging her upward, and she ascended the steps, the whispering chorus swelling into a frenzied hymn. As she sat, the throne came alive beneath her, its surface shifting to cradle her form, its many eyes opening wide to gaze upon her. The crown on her head flared with a searing heat, and the chains melted into the throne, fusing her to its living stone. Her breath caught as a wave of power surged through her, setting her veins alight with gold and shadow. The veiled figures prostrated themselves fully now, their whispers dissolving into a single word chanted over and over, "Reign! Reign! Reign!" Amelia's black eyes swept the hall, her lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. The horned creature approached the steps of the throne, lowering itself to one knee before her. "You have passed through the rooms," it said, its voice a chorus of voices now. "You have descended through the maw and the womb, worn the crown and taken the chains. You are no longer what you were." It raised its head, its eyes meeting hers. "You are the Crimson Queen." The words echoed off the walls, their power sinking into her bones. The throne shuddered beneath her as the walls of the hall split open, revealing passageways leading in every direction, each lined with more kneeling figures, more whispers, more heat. The crown whispered promises she could not fully understand, of dominion, of hunger, of endless descent. The chains coiled lazily at her sides now, their serpentine forms waiting for her command. The creature extended its clawed hand, offering her the blade once more, now blackened and glowing faintly. Amelia took the blade without hesitation, its weight familiar, its warmth alive in her palm. The hall fell silent as she stood, the throne releasing her reluctantly. The veiled figures lifted their heads to watch, their black eyes gleaming with reverence and terror. The horned creature grinned again, its voice soft but clear, "There is still farther to go." The passageways before her pulsed in time with her heartbeat, each promising deeper mysteries, deeper horrors. With a final glance at the throne that had bound her, she stepped down, her chains dragging behind her like a train, the blade raised before her. The whispers resumed instantly, louder than ever, a roar of adoration and dread as she approached the center of the hall. Deeper still, the creature murmured from the shadows, its voice a caress. And as Amelia stepped into the nearest passage, the crown burned brighter, the chains tightened lovingly around her, and the hall behind her sealed with a thunderous sound. The scent of roses thickened in the air as she disappeared into the dark, her whispers echoing long after she was gone. Deeper still. Chapter 10, The Abyss Crowned. The passage closed behind Amelia with a sound like a sigh, sealing her into the endless dark. The air here was heavier, electric, filled with a silence so dense it pressed against her ears. Her crown glowed faintly, illuminating a narrow path of flesh and stone that wound ever downward. The chains at her sides stirred restlessly, slithering along the walls as if tasting the air, eager for what awaited below. She walked on, each step echoing into nothing, her blade steady in her hand, its edge alive with a soft crimson light. As she moved deeper, the air grew warmer, the scent of roses thickening until it was almost suffocating. Veins of gold and black crisscrossed the walls, pulsing faintly, and eyes opened here and there to watch her pass. The whispers returned, hushed and reverent, murmuring titles she no longer recognized but instinctively understood. Queen of the Abyss, they sighed. Mother of Hunger. Bride of the Dark. The chains around her wrists and throat tightened slightly with every name as though affirming them. At last, the path widened into a colossal cavern, vast and circular, its walls slick with what looked like blood and stars. The floor was alive, shifting and rippling beneath her feet, and at its center yawned a bottomless pit ringed with veiled figures. They knelt silently, their bodies fused to the ground, their empty black eyes fixed on her. Above the pit, suspended in the air, was a final throne, larger than all the others, wrought from bone, shadow, and glistening gold. The horned creature emerged from the gloom then, smaller now, its shoulders bowed as it approached and fell to its knees before her. "You have come to the end," it said softly, its many voices low and somber. "And now you will descend no more." The throne above shimmered with an unearthly light, casting strange, writhing shadows across the cavern. "Take your place," the creature murmured. "Complete what you began." Amelia raised her eyes to the throne, her heart pounding with something beyond fear or anticipation, a knowledge that everything she had endured led here. The whispers swelled, becoming a deafening roar that shook the walls and sent dust raining from the unseen ceiling. The chains lifted her from the ground, carrying her upward toward the throne, her black eyes locked on its gleaming form. The blade in her hand vibrated violently, its crimson glow searing into her palm. She reached the throne and stepped onto it, feeling the surface ripple and clutch at her feet. As she sat, the crown flared with a blinding light, its thorns piercing deep, anchoring her to the seat. The throne came alive beneath her, its eyes opening, its veins pulsing as it fused to her body. Power flooded through her veins like molten gold, and the veiled figures below cried out in unison, "All hail the Crimson Queen!" The horned creature raised its head, and she saw her own face mirrored in its black eyes, serene and monstrous. "You are the Abyss now," it whispered. The cavern quaked, the pit beneath her throne deepening, swirling with stars and screams, and the veiled figures dissolved into the shadows. Amelia's chains coiled around her arms and waist like serpents, binding her more completely than ever before, yet she felt no fear, only hunger. The whispers faded to silence, leaving only the sound of her breath and the faint thrum of the abyss below. She gazed into the pit, her black eyes drinking in its infinity, and raised her blade high. The stars within the chasm flared brighter, writhing in ecstasy, and her voice, no longer wholly her own, rang out, filling the cavern, "I reign here. And I will never sleep." The abyss answered with a shuddering roar, its depths opening wider, its light rising to meet her as the throne sank deeper into it. The chains and crown burned against her skin, her body and the throne becoming one as they descended together, her whispers scattering into the void like embers. She closed her eyes, her lips curling into a faint smile, and the last thing she heard before everything dissolved was her own voice in the dark, deeper still. And then there was only silence and the faint scent of roses,